Every day, every single day, things are happening in the world of deals and deal makers. And there's never enough time to keep up with every company, transaction, announcement, or whatever. It's just exhausting. And we have a new product to help fix that. This is Axios Pro Deals, a new premium subscription product bringing you tailor-made insights like never before. For the last 5 years, Axios has helped deal professionals navigate the whole deal landscape with Pro Rata. With Axios Pro Deals, we're diving deeper into the industries that matter most to you. You just want stories on fintech? There's a newsletter for that. MedTech deals? We've got you covered. The future of retail? We'll guide you. With Axios Pro Deals, you're going to be getting all of this industry-specific insight and expert analysis at a level you simply can't get anywhere else. So if you're a venture capitalist, private equity investor, banker, trader, founder, executive, anyone who cares about deals, Axios Pro matters and why. Start your free trial today at AxiosPro.com.
Welcome to What's Next for Energy virtual event. I'm Andrew Friedman, climate and energy reporter at Axios, coming to you from Arlington, Virginia. Welcome to our audiences at Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Axios.com. Join the conversation today on Twitter with @Axios and #AxiosEvents. Over the next 30 minutes, I will be joined by my colleague, Elena Treen, and we'll discuss what's next for energy reliability on the heels of the historic Inflation Reduction Act. Our first guest is Colorado Senator Michael Bennet, joining us today from Washington, D.C. Welcome, Senator Bennet.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
Thanks for being here. Jumping right in, over the years, we've had so many different types of approaches to climate policy that we've tried and didn't necessarily work. From top-down plans to penalize people. Didn't work, yeah, like didn't pass Congress exactly. So penalize, trying to penalize people for polluting, like a top-down approach or cap and trade. Now we have this package that has been enacted, with a plethora of tax incentives and other provisions. And I'm curious how you describe the approach to this and the impacts you expect it'll have of some of these tax incentives, how they'll play out for the average Coloradan, but also for the manufacturing center in your state, which you focused a lot of attention on in the provisions that you authored.
Well, I would say, first of all, this is a major piece of legislation, and I think an incredibly important expression of American global leadership just at a moment when we need that kind of leadership. That's one thing I would say. Second, I think this is a piece of legislation that's going to endure, which is really important too. In other words, I hear people say often, we have to act urgently on climate change, and I completely agree with that. But what's also important is for us to create a durable solution, and this is a durable solution. I don't think the opponents of this legislation are going to be able to reverse this legislation. And that means, combined with the 10-year window that these tax credits have and the size of these tax credits for consumers and for people in the industry, this is going to have a transformational effect over the next decade. It already is. I met with one of the leading utilities in my state today, and they said today that the transition is going to be made much more quickly and much more cheaply in some respects than it would have otherwise done. For the average homeowner, I think they're going to see the benefits of receiving cleaner energy and cleaner power over time, but there are also tax credits that are going to affect them. It's going to make it easier for them to buy heat pumps, to buy electric stoves, to be able to pay for electric heaters and for electric cars. And I think all of that will add up. It could, mean as much as $14,000 to the average family, and that could make a real difference.
And you're someone who's passionate about climate, passionate about the outdoors, especially in your home state. And you also live in an energy producing state. I don't know how many people in the US really think of Colorado as an energy producing state, but it very much is. How do you think the IRA struck a balance between continuing to allow for, and in some cases encourage, fossil fuel production, while also aiming to rein in emissions long term? Were you happy with the balance?
I think a very, very important balance. So before the IRA, I think you could argue that our lack of an energy policy in this country was inflationary, was bad for our national security, bad for economic independence, and really bad at reducing emissions. Coal is up 20% since Joe Biden became president as a result of the rise in prices of natural gas. I think the IRA takes us into a place where over time, we're going to be reducing costs for the American people. It's going to be, these policies are going to be very good for our national security and very good for our economic independence. And this bill is going to reduce emissions by 40%. So finally, we put the template in place to be able to do that. And part of, Andrew, the way this does it is by moving beyond the talking points of both the side of, some supporters of getting something done on climate and the detractors of getting something done on climate, both of which ignored the fact that every single study on which we rely that says that we've got to address climate change tells us that in 2050, when we need to be at net zero, we're still going to be consuming some fossil fuels. There is no country in the world better prepared to lead this transition than the United States of America because of our access to natural gas and because of our innovation in this, and because we're not as corrupt as many other countries. What we were lacking was the policy indicator that we needed to move. And now we have that with the Inflation Reduction Act. And I would say, very importantly, we, for example, have a very effective methane fee that is part of this, that's going to incentivize the industry to make sure that it cleans up our natural gas as much as possible, which is going to be critical to our being able to, with a good conscience, use that LNG in the form of LNG to keep Europe in the fight against Putin and supporting Ukraine. So all these things are related. And as I said in my first answer to your question, I think this is a moment where the United States of America is standing up and leading in a way that I'm extremely proud of.
Yeah. And, to some extent, I think among like hardcore climate activists, this legislation was viewed as a compromise bill. Didn't get all that they wanted necessarily. What bill does really? It incorporated many of your pieces of legislation and some of your colleagues, of course. What do you wish was in there that wasn't on the incentive side or other provisions and remains to be done that you think you want to focus on, in coming years? And what do you think it is the provision that you're most excited about going out and talking to voters about when you're on the campaign trail?
Well, I think that that it is a compromise bill. You can't get everything in any piece of legislation. But I can tell you this, when Joe Manchin walked away from this bill, and I thought we were going to spend another 20 years not making a transition that we should have made 25 years ago, I was devastated because the effect of climate change is all over my state, with the Colorado River being half empty, the worst fires that we've had year after year after year. We have record fires, and I can't, the people I represent and I couldn't take the dysfunction here anymore. We had to have a beginning of this transition, knowing that we're going to have to figure it out over time. Again, we should have started it 25 years ago, but we've now started it. And I think this is a a very good piece of legislation. I still support, putting a fee on carbon, a price on carbon, but we haven't done that in this legislation. But I do think there's enough here to get us going for sure. And the fact that these tax credits, which is one of the things I'm most excited about talking to people at home about, last for 10 years, gives us the kind of certainty that Washington almost is allergic to. And that's hugely important as well. I would add onto that the almost $30 billion in here in conservation and forestry related funds that I was able to get through my subcommittee and the Ag Committee. It's going to be very, very important to Colorado's farmers and ranchers who are deeply concerned about the lack of water, in the Rocky Mountain West, and the fact that we haven't invested in our national forest to protect the critical watersheds that start there. All of that is in this bill. I mean, I can't wait to go to the reddest parts of my state and say, look, this is what a piece of climate legislation actually looks like. And it gives us the opportunity to be able to work together, maybe even the opportunity to begin to stitch the country back together again across some of our political divides.
Yeah, which is a key difference that this piece of legislation has over, past efforts, such as, what happened electorally after the Democrats in the House passed cap and trade. That didn't work out so well on the campaign trail. This is very different, and just you're seeing that difference already, correct? Because of the incentive approach that this takes.
I'm seeing it, and you think about the billions of dollars that are in here for rural co-ops to transition as well. The direct pay that allows rural co-ops to benefit from tax credits they weren't able to benefit from. I was with one of the most significant players on the eastern slope. I'm sorry, the western slope and the eastern plains of Colorado just last week, and they're just thrilled with the provisions that are in this bill because they're going to be able to deliver cheaper energy and electricity more quickly to their ratepayers than they ever would have imagined that they could. And as they're doing it, they're going to be able to move from fossil fuels to renewables at a rate of speed that they didn't imagine. And that most of their service areas are very Republican parts of Colorado. And that's a very thrilling part of this legislation to me.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us. Very much appreciate your perspective and your hard work on this issue.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And next we go to a view from the top segment with Chris Freites.
Good afternoon. I'm Chris Freitz here with your View from the Top segment. And I want to start by thanking our sponsor, the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, for making this conversation possible. And joining me now is NRECA's CEO, Jim Matheson. Jim, welcome to Axios.
It's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
So I want to start with the threats out there, because there seem to be so many threats, including extreme weather, to keeping America's power flowing. And I wonder, what are electric co-ops doing to keep our lights on? And what should the country be doing to keep our electric system as reliable as possible?
Yeah, it's a great question. And reliability has always been one of the touchstones of what electric cooperatives are all about. You keep the lights on. And that in this day and age, there's some real challenges to that because we are seeing extra demand. Extreme weather is creating extra demand, particularly air conditioning load. And at the same time, we see our country shutting down always available baseload power plants. And the idea is some of that's going to be replaced with intermediate resources. And what I mean by that is solar or wind, but the sun doesn't shine 24 hours a day. The wind doesn't blow 24 hours a day. So this is a challenge. I can tell you the electric cooperatives are making investments in their own systems to make them more resilient, to try to make them more efficient in terms of keeping the lights on with limited supply. But at the end of the day, we're also trying to be a voice in the policy arena to explain to anyone who wants to listen that as we move forward as a country, as we're looking at electrifying so much more of our economy in the future, let's be cognizant that we need to take important steps to maintain always available generation capacity to meet those new demands.
And I think you raise a great point there, because those new demands are often stressing some of this system. And when you look at a recent nonprofit report, they highlighted this, right? Showing that there's an elevated risk now of energy shortfalls, of forced blackouts. And I wonder, what do electric cooperatives need to do to ensure that energy reliability during those peak periods when everybody needs their power?
The report you referenced was really important. It was done by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. And that's an entity that's set up specifically to look at reliability of the electric grid, and they have a lot of credibility. And that report did say, look, we're facing greater risk in 2022, and those risks are only going to grow in future years as demand grows, partly driven by extreme weather events. And at the same time, the report said we have this, their words, disorderly retirement of baseload power plants. And so this has got a lot of attention. And what electric cooperatives have done is we really tried to amplify that report and make sure policymakers, both at the federal and state level, understand that the decisions that people are making are going to have an impact on the grid. And we all know we're looking to electrify more of our economy. As I said, look at all the electric vehicle rollouts we hear about. Lowering the overall carbon footprint of this country means we're going to electrify more and more of our economy. So we need to be making a lot more electricity. And right now we're reducing our capacity with these shutdown of power plants. So electric cooperatives are actually communicating a really basic message. That's when you find yourself in a hole, the first step is to stop digging deeper. That's what we're trying to communicate in the policy arena. We're also encouraging that all these different agencies that have different responsibilities, the EPA is interested in air quality, Department of Energy is interested in the electric grid to some degree. States are making those decisions. There are transmission operators out there. There's all these entities that have a piece of the reliability puzzle, but none of them are really in charge of it. And at the end of the day, it's the utility that has to make sure the lights are on every day. And we have all these other agencies affecting our operations, and we want to make sure they understand reliability is a key focus, or should be a key focus, in all their policy recommendations.
Yeah, I think you make a really great point there when you talk about the energy future. As we think about what we want to look like as a country, we are moving toward more electrification. And I wonder, where should policymakers then be focused when they're thinking about electric's reliability as we move forward?
Well, I think they need to be focused on what it takes to keep the lights on in terms of increased demand. And if you're trying to lower the overall carbon footprint of this country, recognize that there may need to be some fossil fuel use maintained in the electric sector to do that. Trying to drive everything down to zero, those last increments are really difficult to reach, and they can have major negative ramifications on reliability. So to me, it's a pretty straightforward discussion. If we're going to electrify so much more of the economy, we got to ask, where's that electricity going to come from? And is that electricity going to be available all the time? solar, wind, the resources that are available part of the time, they can be an important part of a broader portfolio. But at the end of the day, you need power that's there all the time. And that's going to be nuclear or coal or natural gas. And so we have to recognize that portfolio approach. And that's where policymakers need to understand also that if we don't do that, we're going to have greater outages. And I think you lose public support across the board when the lights start going out on a frequent basis. There are a lot of us that think we know a lot about politics, but I think we all know that would not be good for anyone if we have serious intermittent load of electricity across this country. That's not good for anybody.
As a former member of Congress, I'm sure you're familiar with angry constituent calls, and I'm not sure there's more angry calls than I can't get any power to my house, and my food's going bad, I can't work, and my kids are going crazy. So I definitely agree with you there. And I wonder, when you look at the two big laws that have passed recently, the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, did those end up helping or hurting electric co-ops?
Those two pieces of legislation are really big assets for electric cooperatives. It's going to mean a lot in terms of future investment for electric cooperatives. The infrastructure bill has so many different programs that offer funding to build better resilience into the electric system, both on the generation side and on the transmission and distribution side. It's really going to help facilitate the development of electric vehicle infrastructure. So the infrastructure law is an exciting opportunity. And in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, electric cooperatives finally have access to all the tax incentives that the for-profit utilities have had for years in the energy sector. If you want to have a solar plant or a wind plant, you get a tax credit for every kilowatt hour you make. But since electric cooperatives are non-for-profit, we didn't have that incentive, and we'd have to go hire or have a relationship with some third-party group that would build the solar farm or the wind farm, take the tax credit, make a profit, and then give the output to us to distribute to our members. Now we can directly access those tax incentives as electric cooperatives. That's a big deal for electric cooperatives across the country. So those two pieces of legislation give us new tools in the toolbox, more flexibility, more investment capacity for our systems. They're really excited. And I think if we project out 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now, people are going to look back on these two pieces of legislation as having tremendous significance in terms of building out a more reliable electric grid.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Jim Matheson is the CEO of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. Jim, thank you so much for joining Axios.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
And now over to Elena Treen.
Thanks, Chris. I'm Elena Treen, congressional reporter for Axios, and our final guest is Congressman Bob Latta of Ohio, joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us, Congressman.
Well, thank you very much.
Really happy to have you today. So let's just dive right in. I'm curious what you make of the energy provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. I know that it was, of course, a Democrat-only bill, but did you have any involvement in the negotiations, and do you support any of the provisions?
Well, I think it's important to, to look at my district and where I come from on this. I have 86,000 manufacturing jobs. And so I have everything from float glass to steel manufacturing to probably the largest food plant, processing plant in the world, Central Foundry with General Motors in my district. And the best way to say what I have to have in my district is a lot of base load capacity. And I don't see what happened in this piece of legislation is going to be helping us, because the provisions that are in there, I think don't really spell out enough, especially when you're looking at siting on the grid and where this power is going to be going and how it's going to get there. There's really no provisions when you have about $750 million and there's no really specifications there. So I'm really concerned about that. And because again, I have to have a lot of power in my district. And if we don't have the power, we're not going to have people working, and we're not going to have companies either staying or companies coming in. So we've got to have this power.
Were there any provisions in there that you think were good or that will benefit the country, particularly from an energy reliability standpoint?
Well, when you talk on, again, in Ohio, we have a couple of nuclear reactors, provide power for us. And there were some provisions in the legislation. However, again, I don't think it goes far enough because, again, one of our problems is where do we get our uranium from? and especially enriched uranium. And I'm very concerned about that because I've got legislation out there. We got to start doing it here, and you can't be relying on Russia. So again, I think it's a piece of legislation that did not do what it's supposed to do. It's raising taxes out there, and it's doing these other things, but it's not, I don't think it's going to provide the power that we need in this country. And again, if you go back to 2008, we as Republicans came out with our all of the above energy strategy. And what that strategy is of course, to make sure that everything from nuclear to clean coal and natural gas to hydro, and then all of the different types of alternatives out there. But you can't pick the winners and losers out there. And one part of the country is different from another. And that's another part of this piece of legislation I'm concerned about, is that if they go one direction, we're going to have a problem.
And shifting gears a little bit, I know that there's a big energy permitting debate right now on Capitol Hill. I know you know that. What do you make of Congress with these discussions happening right now? It's mainly between Senators Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia and Senators Joe Manchin of West Virginia, and they want to attach such a measure to the short-term stopgap funding bill at the end of this month. Would you support such a provision being attached? And what do you think is needed more so in the energy permitting debate?
Well, and again, I'd have to really see what this language all says before I could really come out and support something. But again, I think you have to have a piece of legislation that's going to be a benefit. And again, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, that you're not picking these winners and losers. And we've got to make sure that we have a power source out there. What they're doing to natural gas in this country on the Democratic side, for years we were told we had no natural gas in the United States. And all of a sudden we can be we're the #1 producer of natural gas in the world, and we need to keep doing that. Because again, it's just the natural gas that we're going to need out there for this winter. And again, for our manufacturing is absolutely essential. But when we start hearing all of the talk out there as to how much just the common citizen is going to pay more this winter for their heating because of the costs going up, we can't have that. And again, this is why it's important that, I think we work together across the aisle, but also from the House and the Senate. And that, because again, we just can't have a piece of legislation that comes from the Senate without the House having its input. And this is why it's so absolutely essential that the Energy and Commerce Committee does its work. And that work is to hold the hearings to make sure we come up with a good piece of legislation. And I think it's important that we come up with a good piece of legislation, because again, one of the things, all the years I've been in Energy and Commerce, I've never heard anybody ever here in committee, or I've never had people back home say this, that they're against regulations. What people are against out there is regulations they just can't live with. And so it's important that we make sure that we get the regulations out there, and meaning we have to have laws in place to make sure we get it done right.
And you just mentioned the Energy and Commerce Committee. I know you're a senior member on that committee. I am curious, if Republicans take back the majority in the House next year, what are some of the key things you think that your committee can be doing to promote some of the provisions that you're talking about? What are the key things you think we should watch for, and provisions we should expect that if Republicans have control of that committee, they'll be working on and trying to roll out over the next Congress?
Well, number one is to have the oversight of this administration. That's going to be absolutely essential that we do. We have not, I think we only had the Secretary of Energy in twice. It's absolutely essential that we have the secretary in, especially for us in the Midwest, especially in Ohio and Michigan, with Line 5 that comes down from Canada through the Upper Peninsula, then the Lower Peninsula of Michigan and Ohio, and with that, how much that about over $5 billion economic impact. It's things like that we have to have that oversight of, but we also have to have the oversight to find out what this administration wants trying to do. But at the same time, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, that we've got to make sure that we're providing the natural gas out there. We're providing, making sure that we have oil, because again, we were so close to having the Keystone XL done. And, we saw everybody out there getting ready to start digging and getting that pipe in, and all of a sudden you have President Biden kill it. So, I think it's really coming up with an energy strategy, which I don't think this administration has. And I think it's important because, again, when I talk about that all of the above energy strategy we've always talked about, but it's just like on the nuclear side, there's so much we could be doing on the nuclear side. And, as Republicans, we have the legislation that we've already been submitting that's important. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we have a modernized grid. But because, again, we have to get this energy from point A to point B. And at the same time, we've got to provide it with Americans, with American energy. We don't want we can't be relying on like Europe is right now. When you hear those reports of 25% of their natural gas and 40% of their oil is coming from Russia. That that's we just can't have that happen, and we want to make sure that, again, that we're taking care of ourselves in this country, and at the same time that we can help our allies out there, especially when you see the Russians always threatening to shut people off.
Right. You mentioned oversight. I do want to ask you more about that because, obviously when it comes to legislation, even if Republicans are in the majority, President Biden is still in the White House. And so legislation might be tough, but oversight will be perhaps easier if you're in the majority next year. Are there specific investigations that you think, particularly from an energy standpoint, that you would want to launch if the committee has the jurisdiction?
Well, and again, right off the bat, you've got to have the secretary in, and after, you've got to find out what's the direction that they want to go on and how they're going to get there. And as I said, I don't think they have an energy policy out there. When you look in California a couple of weeks ago, when California says that they are going to go all electric in their vehicles by 2035, but almost a week later, the governor's saying, you got to make sure you either turn down or turn up your air conditioner or shut them off, and then don't plug in your car. Well, we can't have that happen in this country. And so we got to make sure that, again, you have to have all of the facts. And a lot of these facts are, where are you going to get the rare earth minerals from to make the batteries? We can't be relying on communist China. So these are, all of those issues, if you're thinking about from electric vehicles to how you're going to get the charging stations, how you're going to get the grid out to these places. In some part, you might not have any electricity right now. So how are you going to do it? So, a lot of times they always talk these great games, but it's like, okay, no, if you're going to say it, now tell me how you're going to do it. And just to say that we're going to be, as the president says, you want to be by 2035. And, in my view of this is very simple. I don't have a concern as to what Americans want to drive. If you want to drive a combustible engine, fine. If you want to drive an electric car, fine. But the federal government should be the one mandating it, because I tell you, the more we get into it as the federal government, then usually it's going to turn out poor and very poorly for the consumer.
Thank you so much, Congressman. I think we've reached all the time we have today. I feel like I have so many questions I could keep asking you, but this has been a really informative interview, and we really appreciate the time that you took to be with us today. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for another virtual conversation that has made everyone smarter, faster. For more on what's next for energy, sign up for Andrew's Generate newsletter or my sneak peek newsletter at axios.com/newsletters, or visit the Axios app. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you on axios.com.